My name's Agnes Kamenetz. Welcome to the Woods in Your Backyard Partnership Natural Areas Management Services webinar series, a case study. I'm your host, Agnes Kamenetz, and with the University of Maryland. We'll get right to it. I hope you guys have been enjoying looking through your publications, the Woodland Health Practices Handbook, and I have really gotten to love that checklist. I really utilize that checklist. I do love it. So I hope you guys are enjoying the materials that you received for this webinar series. So last week, Andrew was your host, and you talked about developing a woods in your backyard land care plan for clientele. Very interesting stuff that you did there. I heard it was a good turnout and lots of great information and really great speakers. I'm sorry I missed it. This week is going to be improving tree health and managing deer problems. And then next week, our final week, will be converting lawn to natural areas and controlling invasive plants. And this case study idea will carry through the 3 weeks together. So today's webinar, improving tree health and managing deer problems. This webinar will cover 2 of the specific management practices determined as a high priority in the checklist and outlined in the land care plan for the case study property. The first management recommendation covers how to improve tree health and habitat by thinning overcrowded trees and releasing chosen or crop trees. Next, this session will discuss how to identify and mitigate the negative impacts of deer overabundance. Methods to assess deer impacts, as well as small and large scale methods to reduce the impact of deer vegetation, will also be addressed. Our speakers, we have 2 speakers today. Our first speaker will be Joe Rosetti. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Forest Resource Management from West Virginia University. Go Ears. He has spent most of his career with the Virginia Department of Forestry doing forest inventory and analysis data collection as an area forester in southeastern Virginia, and then a field forester and supervisor in north central Virginia. Over his time at the Virginia Department of Forestry, Joe wrote the first identification key for the trees of Virginia identification guide. He has been active in invasive plant management guidance and instruction, trained numerous staff in forest management and forest management plan writing, and has been active in wildland firefighting and firefighting training. Joe is also the first hardwood forest habitat initiative coordinator for the agency developing and leading the new program to improve Virginia's hardwood forests through intentional professional management. All right, and I'm going to save the introduction of our next speaker after we go through some housekeeping. I'm going to keep you in suspense. So I'm Agnes. I'm your host for today. Andrew was your host last week. I'm the Woodland Stewardship Educator for University of Maryland Extension. I enjoy my job a lot and glad to be hosting today. One thing that has changed this week that you really want to take note of is how you're going to get your continuing education credits. This is very important. A link in the chat will be put in the chat near the end of the webinar, and please click on that link and fill out the form that comes up, okay? So near the end of the webinar, in the chat, I'll put a link, and you need to click on that to fill out the form to be able to get your credits. Then a certificate will be emailed to you, and then you can send that to whatever approved association that you want to get your credits from. So hopefully throughout, we'll give you a few reminders that near the end of the webinar, we'll put a link in the chat that you click on to get to the form to fill out to get your credits. And as per last week, questions can be put in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen there. Any comments, good, clean forestry or wildlife jokes can go in the chat. We're open to that. And finally, at the end, about a week after our final session, an evaluation of the webinar series will be sent out to you. We really appreciate your feedback, because then we'll understand and know what you guys want to learn more of, how in depth you want to get in some of the topics that you're hearing about today. So today's speakers, yes, Joe Rosetti, look at his picture there because he was the he wrote the first identification key for the Trees of Virginia Identification Guide. That book may look familiar to some of you guys. I know I use that resource with landowners all the time. Even though I'm in Maryland, I still use that. So I'm a little awestruck that Joe is here and wish we were in person to get an autograph of it. I'm also awestruck that we have Luke Macaulay with us. He's the wildlife specialist at the University of Maryland Extension, where we work out of the same office at the Y Research and Education Center. He has statewide responsibilities, and his extension programs provide educational information to a variety of groups and stakeholders, including wildlife enthusiasts and naturalists, people experiencing issues with wildlife damage, and game management for hunting. Luke earned his PhD from University of California, Berkeley. I'm excited to have you both here. This is going to be a great conversation. So without further ado, why don't we begin our session? I'll stop sharing my screen. And I understand Joe will be next.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here and get to talk with all of you about hardwoods, among my favorite topics in the world. To be clear, I did not write the book, the Native Trees of Virginia. My only contribution was the key at the front, but that was fun to do. So today we are going to focus on crop tree management or chosen tree management. I will try to refer to that as chosen tree management, but if I slip up and refer to it as crop tree management, you'll just have to forgive me. That this technique was initially developed as crop tree management, and with that title, with a real focus on timber production and that purpose, but it has applications beyond timber production, and for that, just the term of chosen tree management works a little bit better, because you can choose trees for all kinds of purposes, even if they're not going to be a crop in the future. For the book, you have been using the term chosen tree management was used. That may work better with the landowners that you work with. So I will try to use that today also. So you see my objectives for the day and the next 45 minutes or so. And if you have any questions, I believe you're going to put those in the question box at the bottom or side of your screen, wherever that is, and we'll address all those together at the end. All right, so I was going to get into a real detailed tree biology lesson, but honestly, this is what it boils down to as to why this works. People will apply fertilizer to a tree or to their lawn and say, I am feeding my lawn or feeding my tree, but really you're not. You're giving the plants the substrate they need in order to make food, but trees and all plants make food in their leaves. And it works. So this chosen tree management works because trees make food in their leaves. When trees make more food, they grow faster. Leaves require space in order to be developed and grow and make their food and get lots of light and everything. And so quite simply, more space means more leaves, means more food, means more growth in the tree. Trees compete primarily for space. In our part of the world, in the central hardwoods of North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, trees don't compete for water. They don't compete for nutrients, at least not in most sites in these. We get plenty of rainfall. There's plenty of nutrients in the soil available for all the plants, more than they can use. And so the plants are really competing for light. I saw a few people sign in from Colorado. I have no idea what that kind of situation is there on your site. And also, that said, in some places in the coastal plain or on really dry, rocky ridge tops with poor soils, trees are competing for nutrients also. But for the most part, on clayey or loamy soils, trees are only competing for sunlight. So with chosen tree management, what we're doing is concentrating site resources on the most desirable trees. When forests start growing, there are lots of trees, thousands per acre. I just saw some data today from a field site in southwestern Virginia. At age 15, there were still 3,000 trees per acre. And many of those trees are going to die in the next 30 years as the forest thins itself. So what we want to do as managers is choose which trees are going to be the ones that survive and make it into the forest later. So we're going to arrange our management activities to concentrate the site resources onto the most desirable trees. When we do that, those trees are able to increase diameter growth, increase mass production, and may save trees that would die otherwise that we would really like to have in the stand later. But if they're not helped out, then they may not make it. The beautiful thing about chosen tree management is that it virtually always works when it's applied, so long as the trees that you're choosing are still at a point where they're capable of responding. This really is an individual tree management practice. In forestry, we generally work with stands and managing at the stand level, but in this, you're really looking for the individual trees within the stand that we want to promote, or that you want to promote, and managing around those and concentrating your management on those. We refer to this as a mid-rotational practice. It is for managing the existing stand, the existing crop of trees. Crop tree management is not a practice to use to establish new regeneration in the understory. It is not for establishing or promoting an herbaceous understory, and it is not an end of rotation kind of harvest, a kind of merchantable harvest, if that's what you're going for eventually. This is a mid-rotation practice. The reason that this is not for establishing understory and establishing regeneration is because you're going to continue managing the crop of trees you have. You're so far away from the next forest and the next crop of trees that you're likely, you're going to have another 40, 50 years in order to establish that regeneration. And we generally are not opening the canopy enough, not cutting enough trees in order to really establish an herbaceous understory. The canopy will still close again, and so whatever's established in the whatever herbaceous plants are established in the understory are going to get shaded out in the next several years again. Also, do want to stress now, and I'll probably say this a few more times, every tree in the forest can't be chosen. As I referenced earlier, we'll see stands at 15 years old that are 3,000 trees per acre. When those get to be 80 years old, there'll be 80 to 100, maybe 120 trees per acre, 150 on the high end. So clearly a lot of trees are not going to make it, so every tree can't be chosen. So how do you do this? The first step, and we'll go through these one by one, but this is the process of carrying out chosen tree management and really of carrying out most management activities. So define landowner objective. This is often the hardest part. It is one of the hardest parts for landowners. And that's me there talking to a landowner, and it looks like he's saying, I have no idea. What are you talking about? I never thought of objectives. And that's pretty common. The bullets up there are things that I commonly hear, and you will when you talk to landowners about this. But managing for wildlife sounds great, but it isn't specific enough to be an objective. Landowners, and you have to help landowners with this, drill down through these sorts of things to say, what exactly does that mean? And it has to be specific enough to be actionable. So in terms of, but crop tree management or chosen tree management can be used to help with any one of these sorts of objectives. once they're specific enough. In terms of value, chosen tree management can be used to increase value in the forest and value in the timber. When you're doing that, you want to select individual trees that are pretty straight for the first 18 feet of the trunk. That's the merchantable part of the tree at the end of the rotation, and be selecting species that you expect are going to be merchantable when that time comes. In our part of the world, that's generally the oaks, northern red oak and white oak especially, yellow poplar, hickory, and black walnut and black cherry. If you can find stems that are good enough of those species. But in parts of West Virginia and Pennsylvania, especially, black cherry is the premier species. Wildlife goals are great, but they have to be narrowed down in order to be actionable and use chosen tree management. What kind of species are you managing for specifically? What kind of wildlife species? Chosen tree management does a great job of increasing mast production, increasing wildlife food from hard mast, nut producing trees like hickories, walnuts, oaks, and also increase flowering and soft mast production. All of those things occur in the crown of the tree. So as you give the crown more space and the crown gets bigger, the tree has more space to and more buds, more opportunities to produce flowers and produce fruit. So it increases the mast production. Diameter growth is correlated to crown size, and mast production is also correlated to crown size. So as crown size goes up, diameter growth and seed production or wildlife food production from that also goes up. Aesthetics and aesthetic goals, I'd say the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So when a landowner gives you that kind of goal, you have to find out what does that mean for them. We often think of flowering trees like redbuds and dogwoods, serviceberry, plum, which is great, but those end up as small trees and in the understory, and we're not generally going to use that chosen tree management kind of practice to promote that. In a young stand where they're still in the canopy, you could do that, but eventually they are going to end up in the understory. They're just not going to grow to the full canopy height of 70 or 80 or 90 feet of a hardwood forest. Fall Keller is something else that we often hear about in the east for aesthetics, and for that you want to identify trees that are the Kellers that the landowner really likes. Sassafras, black gum, red maple, sugar maple, persimmon are all good choices for that. They have brilliant Kellers, yellows, reds, oranges, and some of those species are things that foresters, traditional production foresters would kind of wince at using as crop trees like black gum or red maple. We generally don't favor those in forestry for timber production, but we can arrange the goals or arrange the management to the landowner's goals. And so when those species fit the landowner's goals for aesthetics or wildlife habitat, then that's what we manage for. Lastly, forest health. The way you use chosen tree management for forest health is to just ensure a variety of species make it into the final canopy. And so for that, you would have to look at whatever suite of species you have and select some of each, and really not be favoring one species over another. We would also tend to not favor things that we know are going to have health problems, have insect or disease problems. So for that, you should look at what's in your area that is going to be a problem and what the forest health experts in your area or your state are expecting to be a problem. And you can reach out to Extension or your forestry agency for that. So the next step is to inventory the forest. This is often the easiest part, as how to do an inventory is pretty well defined, and really its own course in itself, but it doesn't have to be super extensive. How extensive you make it depends on the landowner objective and how much land you're managing, and to some degree what you expect to find and how much variety you expect to find. At a minimum, to do your inventory, you need the species that are in the main overstory of the forest and the canopy, species in the understory or that have already regenerated, some kind of measure of tree density, whether trees per acre or basal area, and any major landscape features that are going to be significant in your management, like steep slopes, rock, or streams that need to be crossed. Then you have to define the characteristics of your chosen tree. You have to describe that so that when you go into the woods to identify them, you know it when you see it. And some people say, never mind, I'll know it when I see it. Well, in order to do this well, you have to determine the criteria beforehand so that you recognize it when you see it, and then you will know it when you see it. So the characteristics we'll look for is the species that are going to meet the landowner goals that was available on their site, stem quality, if that's going to be important in the landowner's goals. It could be things such as presence of a cavity or a likelihood of this tree to be a denning tree in the future if they had a specific wildlife goal that's going to require cavities. And crown class of the tree is going to be important in picking out the tree. And we'll get to some more on crown class and how to identify that a little bit later. So next, when you go out in the woods to pick your crop trees, you want to identify them. After you identify them in the woods, you want to mark them so that they can be kept track of. And whenever you or someone else come back to do the release work, you can find them again and find them quickly. Use either flagging or paint. The tree in the middle there is painted with a nice bright orange paint, few inch wide band. Paint is nice because it lasts for a while, so you can easily come back to your crop trees to keep track of them and monitor them, re-release them if it's needed. But paint does last for a while. So if that's not something a landowner wants out there on their property, then use flagging. Do you pick the trees based on your criteria? As far as number, we often are looking for 25 to 40 trees per acre. More than 40 is just kind of a lot. And if you're into that, then we should be looking at a different kind of practice, more of a true thinning as opposed to crop tree management, or something else altogether. Less than 20 or 25 chosen trees per acre, and you're going to be doing a lot of work hunting through there, and we get to the point of saying, is this something that's worth doing if there are so few? So you really would want to go out looking for a minimum of 20, 25, and I often end up around 30 trees per acre when I'm doing this. That ends up being a roughly 30 to 45 foot spacing. It does work out pretty well that a 35 trees per acre is a 35 foot spacing between trees. So that one is easy to remember. I know I've thrown a lot of numbers at you here in the last minute, but if you would want to keep that target in your mind of 35 trees per acre is a 35 foot spacing, that works out pretty well. Now, of course, we do understand that hardwood forests are established naturally. They are not on a uniform spacing. So all of this is very rough. And when you go out with a target of a 35 foot spacing, you might be anywhere from 20 to 40 feet between trees, and just count them as you go and see how you do. From practice, I can tell you that the tendency is to mark a lot fewer than you intend when you go out. And I think that's because as you walk through the woods, when you get to the spot, when you get, as you pace or walk through the woods, and you get to the spot where you are looking for a chosen tree to pick, or a tree to choose, I guess, you tend to look in front of you, the direction that you're going. And when you find it in front of you further, if it's another 5 or 6 feet, you walk another 6, 8, 10 feet to get to it, mark it, and then start going from there for your next one. Just be mindful of that, and try not to mark them further and further and further apart as you go. As you're identifying them, you want to use the criteria that you developed earlier. Don't forget that as soon as you walk into the woods and you see a beautiful tree. But you do have to pick from what's available. And sometimes the beautiful trees aren't always available. In the middle of this picture is a scarlet oak. Scarlet oak on this site was not our first choice. The tree on the right is a yellow poplar, and they are competing. They're both well up in the canopy. The landowner wanted oak, and while scarlet oak is not the most desired tree, there weren't a lot of oaks on this site. And so we went ahead and picked the scarlet oak, and that yellow poplar will end up getting cut. So you do have to pick from what's available. When I walked up to this tree, I wish I had taken a picture from the side I saw it. You couldn't see the fork in the tree. The fork was in parallel with the way I was looking. So I was looking straight up it, and it looked like a great single stem scarlet oak, and walked around it and then saw the fork. So I've picked trees that I thought were going to be good and walk around them and find a cat face in one side or some cavity that for a crop tree purpose is not, and future merchantability is going to be a problem. So make sure you walk around the tree before you start painting it. Maybe that's another good reason for flagging. It's easier to take flagging off the tree than paint. But also, depending on landowner objective, having that fork in the tree may not be a problem. In this tree, it's above the first log, so it still has the opportunity for good merchantability. So in identifying chosen trees, we are largely going to be working in the codominant and intermediate tree crown class. So these are, those terms are crown class, and within this, D represents dominant, C, codominant, I, intermediate, and S is suppressed. Dominant trees generally don't need released. If we do nothing in that stand, those trees are going to win, and they're going to be part of the future stand. The releasing them, cutting the competing trees is going to help them, but even if you don't cut competing trees, those dominant trees are going to persist in that forest for until there's some kind of stand replacement event. You'll recognize those in the forest because they don't really look crowded. They look like they're winning. They're either a good bit taller than the other trees around them, or their crowns are much broader than the other trees around them. Codominant trees, like this one and this one, are most of the trees in the forest. That's what is generally making up the canopy. They are receiving full sunlight on the top and partway down the sides. If you want to make sure that these codominant trees persist into the forest later in the stand, later in the life of the stand, then they would benefit from release. Many of those will remain in the stand even if you do nothing, but releasing them will help. Intermediate trees, here like this one, and this one, these will need released if you want them in the future forest. If they are not released, they will not make it into a future forest. They will end up being outcompeted by the codominant and dominant trees around them, and they'll eventually die. Suppressed trees, these down here are ones that don't receive any direct sunlight. They will not respond well to release, and they just shouldn't be considered as potential chosen trees. They basically already lost in this forest. So here, the trees that we're going to choose in this forest, or in this section of stand, have been marked with blue flagging. So we picked an intermediate tree because it was a species that we want that was not well represented in the stand. We couldn't find a decent codominant stem of that tree, and so we're going to release this one. This often happens in mixed oak and poplar stands. The yellow poplar will frequently outgrow the oak early in the life of the stand, and the oak needs some help in order to stay in that stand. So next step in carrying this out is to kill the competing trees in order to release the crowns of our chosen trees. As we said in the beginning, trees compete for light. They're not competing for water and nutrients. So trees that are suppressed down here, that are under the crown of our chosen trees, are not really competing for sunlight. So you don't have to do anything to them. They can stay in the stand. They will likely eventually die. Some of these, like this one, will benefit for a little while from that release, but it's still not going to have a significant enough. It's not going to have enough of a growth response where it's going to jump up and start competing in the canopy of the forest. So competing trees can be cut out of the stand and removed. They can be cut and left. That is my preferred method for doing this, to actually sever the stem and cut it down, because then you know this job is done. You know that your crop tree has been released, and it's happened immediately. You don't have to wait for your competing trees to die. The alternative is that you can girdle them. You could kill them and leave them in place, leave the standing dead tree in place. Dead trees don't take up growing space. So doing this also effectively releases your crop tree. There are other benefits to doing it this way. Standing dead trees can be dens for wildlife as they form cavities. They're a food source for insects, which are a food source for everything else. As the bark starts to loosen and fall off of the trees, that's a good roosting and denning sites for bats underneath. So there's good reasons to do this if that's something that you and your client are willing to wait for in the stand, is kind of wait for those trees to die. To do a girdle, you cut with a chainsaw or a hatchet into the trunk of the tree at least an inch the whole way around in a continuous line. And you do that twice on the trunk of the tree, several inches apart vertically on the trunk. With herbicide, you can do a hack and squirt herbicide application. You can do basal application, and all of these are described. It's described how to do all of these in your book. Okay. One thing to keep in mind is that girdling does not always work. Now, these trees are both girdled once and not twice, but the one on the left did have a pretty significant hunk cut out of that tree. That's a yellow poplar. It calloused over that and kept on going. And the picture on the right, that tree was girdled. If you can look closely at that picture, the bottom part of that tree below about hip height, the part of the sapwood is even rotted off. But above that height, the tree looks just fine, and it had live buds and is growing and looking fantastic. It's another yellow poplar. So yellow poplar and red maple are kind of notorious for not succumbing to girdling. So if you want to leave those in the stand, you will really have to use herbicide, or you'd have to use herbicide. Otherwise, cut them down if they're competing with your chosen tree. Next to your monitoring, I do encourage you to monitor your stand and keep track of these chosen trees. It gives you an opportunity to see how well you did, continue measuring them every few years. In order to really describe, though, how much benefit you got from releasing the chosen tree, you would have to also be measuring unreleased trees every year that are similar, same species, similar size, similar crown position. And then as you see the difference grow between those trees over time, you'll be able to see how much benefit you got out of the release of that chosen tree. The trees would grow even if you don't release them. So that's why you have to compare it to something else. You want to monitor the crowns to see if they need released again, because your chosen tree will grow and the trees around it will grow. And so if you do this, or when you do this early in the life of the stand, it's likely to need to be done again in 10, 15, 20 years. How long that takes depends on the stand, depends on the stand age, species that are there, the species of your crop tree, the species of the trees around it. There's one site in Virginia where the crop tree release was done 15 years ago. I was there a few months ago, and they are still free to grow. Many of the chosen trees there are still free to grow after 15 years. On another site that was a little bit younger, some trees needed re-released at 10 years. So it really just depends on the site, and that's why you have to monitor it. Remark your trees if you're going to keep coming back to them. And if you use flagging, adjust that flagging. Yeah, if you can look closely at that tree, the tree is actually being constricted by the flagging. It's being slowly girdled by the flagging as it grows. So even flagging may not break off. So if you use flagging, remove it and adjust that every couple of years. One thing to keep in mind also, there is no height growth response from chosen tree management. There's only a diameter growth response. So you can measure heights, but you're not going to see a height growth response as a result of this. Height growth in trees is basically fixed as a function of site quality, how good the soils are and how much rainfall there is. And so there isn't really a height response, which is beneficial to you as you do your monitoring, because it's a lot easier to measure diameters and heights. So best candidate kind of forests, where are you going to do this? Young forests respond best to this. As young as age 10, really all the way up to age 30. Vigorous trees will respond to this. So even in older than 30 years old in older stands, they will still respond. I've looked at tree cookies, tree cross sections and counted rings, and found that trees had growth responses at 70 and 80 years old to getting more sunlight. But as trees get older, on average, they get less vigorous. So the younger the tree, generally, the more vigorous the tree is, the healthier it is and the better it can respond to this. Also, younger trees tend to be smaller, so it's easier to cut the competing trees, and so it's just easier to carry this out. Trees with high stem density help. You frequently find that in younger forests, but another benefit of high stem density is that you have a lot more trees to pick from to find your chosen trees. In order to get a picture of this stand, the photograph there in the slide, it is good for that. There'll be a few more coming up, one more coming up. But to give you another way to think about this, if you know good woodcock or ruffed grouse habitat, that's what those kinds of stands benefit from this a lot. As soon as the blackberries die, if you have a stand that regenerates naturally and starts growing, once the blackberries are shaded out in the understory and all the grass is shaded out, that's when you can start doing this kind of practice well. but these stands still might be kind of hard to walk through just because there's a lot of stems. You have to kind of dodge around the trees in order to get it. For income purposes, especially, you would want to concentrate the management on the best growing sites and do this on north-facing slopes, east-facing slopes, floodplains, toe slope positions. Places with good soil are your best growing sites, and you get the best financial return managing your best growing sites. Again, I said this earlier, you have to manage what you have. When you go out to do this, you have to pick from the trees that are available, that are on the site. And if you're working on a property that only has poor soils, then that's what you have. And so that's where you do your management. Trees there will still benefit from this. It will just be less noticeable, I guess. And if you have better growing sites available, it's generally in the landowner's interest to concentrate management there. Younger stands also, it's easier to do this and not damage other trees. As you move into larger tree size, then if you're going to be cutting your competing trees and cutting them down, then you're likely to do a good bit of damage in the stand. So just another picture there of a young, vigorously growing hardwood forest. Those of you that know your tree ID will recognize white oak in that. There's a lot of white oak in this stand that's still in a codominant position. So this is a great place to be doing this. And in fact, we are doing crop tree release in this stand in Virginia. So to do your release, here's a picture of about a 4-inch diameter white oak, great looking tree. And as I said, you pick from the best you have. There is a small crook in that stem, but again, this is a 4-inch diameter white oak. Future income is a goal here, and white oak is much more valuable than the low grade red oaks that were around this. So, so this white oak was going to be selected. Also, small defects in the stem like that, small crooks, a little bit of sweep, a little bit of bend in the stem will basically grow out of the tree as the tree grows in diameter. I believe those kinds of things are always there. Once it's in the tree, it's always going to be there, but it's a lot less noticeable in, or at least that amount of crook in this 4-inch tree is a lot less noticeable when this tree is 16 inches or 18 inches in diameter than it is when this tree is 4 inches in diameter. White oak also is a great wildlife mast producing tree. The acorns are very palatable for a variety of species. Oak support an awful lot of insects in the crowns. Lots of things eat oak trees and lots of things eat oak leaves. So there's several reasons to keep this tree in the stand. This is the same picture you saw earlier, that scarlet oak. Here we're going to only cut the yellow poplar to the right. The other scarlet oak to the left is not really competing with our crop tree. As we said, these trees are competing for sunlight. So when you choose what trees to release or what trees to cut to do your release, you need to be looking up into the canopy of the forest and cut the trees that have adjacent crowns. If on the left side of that scarlet oak, there's a whole lot of space. There is nothing competing with this tree on that side. This tree only has one, we only have to cut one tree in order to fully release the scarlet oak, in order to fully release this scarlet oak, this tree. So doing crop tree release doesn't take very long. And I did put a video in here. Hopefully this will work. This is a coworker of ours here in Virginia doing this as a demonstration. He's using a battery-powered chainsaw, which many foresters laughed at whenever he pulled it out, but it is fast, it's easy, they're relatively light, and the best thing about it is the chain stops when you let go of the trigger. So I didn't have any experience with it before I saw him do this, and they're great little tools for doing this. If you're doing this in a small, young forest like this one, as we said, that's where this is effective. A small saw works really well. It's a lot lighter to lug through the woods, and the short bar is helpful because you're less likely to nick something else and have problems with kickback. That's all I'm going to say about the saws. But that was all the time it took him to release one crop tree. And in fact, that was the tree he released. I wasn't counting as he was going through. He cut 3 or 4 trees in 45 seconds. So this is something that doesn't take long to do. Now you do have to then walk to the next tree. That is going to take longer than it does to cut the trees competing with this crop tree. So you can see in this picture, you do still see leaves here. They look like they're around the crown, but these are well under the crown of the crop tree. So they're not competing, so we don't cut them. And that's all you have to do to release the crown of that tree. That one is now free to grow and is going to be all set for another 10 to 15 years on this site. Stump sprouts. I get lots of questions about stump sprouts. Stump sprouts have a bad reputation with many foresters, loggers, and sawmillers. They think all of them are rotten on the inside, and I do not subscribe to that opinion. Many of our hardwood forests now, are made up entirely or almost entirely of stump sprouts because our hardwood forests in mid-Atlantic states have been clear cut so many times. If all of those trees were going to be rotted in the middle and yucky, then all of our hardwoods would be rotted in the middle and yucky, and they just aren't. What you want to do is be releasing these trees and cutting competing sprouts. So you want to pick 1, maybe 2 sprouts on the stump and cut the other sprouts on the stump before they start to compete side to side and before those stems are touching side to side. This is a crop tree where the competing sprouts were cut, or the other sprouts were cut in 2005. And this picture was taken in 2022, just in January. Once those sprouts rot off the rest of the way, I don't think someone in the future would look at that and even guess that was a stump sprout. Except for you guys, because now you'll know that was a stump sprout. So when you go to the state forest there in Virginia, you will recognize that tree. Here's another one that was released at the same time. This one's a yellow poplar, kind of notorious for having rot problems. And we were actually walking around looking for trees that had been released that we thought would have rot problems. And we thought were going to have a defect in the stem as a result of the crop tree release. And so that's what the tree looked like. Nice big cavity. That's why we picked it. So we cut it down, and here's what it is when it's cut. We had the guy with the saw cut further down into the tree in order to try to find some. And this is where one of the sprouts was cut, and the tree grew around that and calloused over that damage, and just kept on going. So no evidence of rot in that stem after, 15 years or so, 17 years, I guess, because that was in 2005. So 16, 17 years. That yellow poplar, at the time we cut it, was about 12 inches in diameter. So it would still have another 20 years probably to be merchantable at 16, 18 inch diameter. So there is still the chance that at that point it would look bad, but no evidence of it at this point, at least. So don't shy away from stump sprouts. Just get to them before those sprouts touch side to side. If you have a site where the stems are touching side to side like that, then you can't release those. What happens is when they hit side to side, the trees are both trying to grow in diameter. They're pushing on each other, and they will squeeze the cambium and kill the growing cells where they touch. And that is the way that fungus gets into the tree and rot is initiated in those stems, and why those end up with rot later. So you want to get to them before the stems touch side to side. So in closing, I've happened across this stump while looking at a logging operation here in Virginia in Culpeper County. It's a black oak, and I got into the habit of counting tree rings on stumps because I'm a forester and it's fun and I'm interested. While I don't have any specific information on the history of this stand, from counting the growth rings and looking at size differential and sustained changes in diameter growth, I can tell you that this stand was thinned here when it was 18 years old at that point, and the growth rate increases all the way until you get out in here somewhere when another thinning happened and growth rate increases again, and was sustained all the way until the tree was about 80 years old. And then you started to see growth rate decrease as the tree approached a final harvest or rotation age for this tree. So what that tells me is that the first release in this happened around this tree happened when it was 18 years old, right in the time frame where we're telling you to do crop tree release in a young, high stem density forest. This tree responded well to it, and it needed a second release in order to maintain that good growth rate. This tree got it. So this is the kind of thing that I think we can expect in another 60, 80 years out of the forest that we're working in now, because I don't think the trees' habits have changed since 1932 when this black oak started growing. Lots of fun history in trees. And with that is all I have for you today. So again, my name is Joe. My email address is there. If anybody wants to contact me directly, you are more than welcome to. And I think we'll be taking questions together as a group at the end. Is that right, Agnes?
Yes, you're right. Questions at the very end. I know that some questions have come up for you, Joe, already, but we're going to reserve that till after Luke's conversation about deer management. Because I also have some questions about your thing. You got me very curious and mindful of all this. I really appreciate your passion and love for the forest. What a great story to tell when you're writing it on the stump, the ages like that. That's beautiful. Luke, I see that you're prepping to get your slide coming up. That's great. Good, smooth teamwork, you guys. Appreciate it.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, thank you, Joe, for that presentation. And this is, going to be a bit different, and but excited to give this talk. So let's just dive right in. So this is that. This slide might be familiar from last week. This is the sort of case study that we're working from as an example for how you in the green industry or landscapers might think about helping a property owner with a variety of different types of vegetation on their landscape. So they have their house up here on the right, stream coming through. This area on top right's mowed, bottom right's an old cool season grass pasture, probably fescue. Here on the bottom left is mature woods with trees that are foot and a half diameters, and we have young woods up here on the top left. So this is just a model for an example for how you might think about coming to a landowner with this mix of different habitat types or different landscape characteristics, and how you might work with them on managing deer problems. And the client goals are up here on the top left. They provided you as a landscaper. They said, I want to mow less. I want healthier trees, control invasives, reduce deer impacts, improve habitat for songbirds and pollinators, and finally improve the stream and water quality. So we'll talk about how deer impacts and a few of these other things like less lawn to mow and habitat for songbirds can be played in with deer management. So here's a brief outline of what we'll cover in the next 50 minutes. I want to make sure we leave about 10 minutes for questions. But the first is, what's the problem? Why do people care about deer? A lot of people want deer. So we'll talk about a little bit of that. briefly go over identifying the damage for deer and making sure you're diagnosing the right animal species. Third, we'll cover a little bit of deer biology and their life cycle, just to give you a broader understanding, a depth of knowledge that when you show up and meet with a landowner who you're trying to sell your services to, you can show that you're more knowledgeable and throw out some interesting facts about how deer behave. And I think that will help show that you're knowledgeable about the topic. And then the next one is assessing deer impacts. We'll briefly cover that, and then finally talk about mitigation. And the bulk of the talk will be on mitigation deer impacts and cover these 4 main categories of how you can try to stop damage. So I'm trying to get this. There we go. Okay. So what's the problem? Let's dig right in. What's the problem? There's a lot of literature that has shown that that overabundant populations of white-tailed deer cause a lot of problems in the vegetation. They reduce species richness. They oftentimes can lead to exacerbating problems of invasive species. So for all these reasons, and here's a few papers and there's many more, there's oftentimes a desire to manage the deer population so you can have a healthier ecosystem, a healthier plant community on the landscape. Here's an image got from Jonathan Kays. This is in Maryland, where you have a relatively high deer fence here, and behind that fence, deer are excluded, and obviously on the right, deer are free range. So you can see the difference that's made over a period of time on the landscape with deer browsing, absent versus present. So briefly covered a little bit of damage. Now I want to dig into identifying the cause of damage, because sometimes people might misdiagnose what's causing it. Oftentimes damage happens in the middle of the night, and we might not know what happened. So here's a couple of examples of violets on the left that have been ripped off, and on the right, somebody's hostas that have also been clean cut off. Now, these aren't the same species of animal. And again, this might be the thing that if you get to a landowner's property and they say, look at this damage I've got, looking at the characteristics between these 2 pictures might really impress a potential client. So the difference is these are 2 different species, and the first one on the left is deer, and the one on the right is rabbit. So you might be able to immediately see what those differences are, but I'll show a couple more pictures too. Here on the left is a picture I just took actually this morning of a purple top turnip that's been chewed off by a deer, and on the right we have a stem of rabbit damage. Again, you might start to notice some of these characteristics. In particular, the deer always have this rough, broken, sort of jagged edge. It's just ripped off. Whereas on the right, you see this nice, clean-cut, angled snip that's happened. So rabbits have, and what's causing this difference, again, deer on the left, rabbit on the right, the cause of this difference, and an easy way that you might be able to remember this and help you remember which is deer are ungulates. Just like cows, ungulates don't have top teeth. You look, especially on the front, on their incisors, they do not have incisors on the top of their mouth. If you can see here, they have teeth on the bottom and they have molars in the back on top and bottom, but they don't have teeth on the top. So what they do is they actually grab and rip vegetation to be able to eat it. Whereas you can see here on this picture of the skull of a rabbit, they have teeth on the top and bottom and can get these nice clean cuts. So that's one example of something you might see, and you might be able to really help identify some of the problems, what's causing some of the damage. So another piece that we can dig, and there's a lot of other types of wildlife damage I can get into, but if you have questions about them, I'm happy to cover them as well at the end. Beavers and voles and all sorts of other things cause damage on the landowner's property, but we'll focus on deer, and I think rabbits are maybe one of the more common things that might be confused with deer. So covering deer biology and life cycle. I'd like to cover just the concept of carrying capacity. This has briefly been alluded to in some other presentations, but here's this sort of perfect model of how a wildlife population grows over time. And the green line shows this sort of slow growth in the beginning, it goes to fast growth, and then as the population hits what we call carrying capacity, the maximum population that an area can support, that growth slows down. There's not enough food for the animals. Reproduction rates decrease, death rates increase, and you have a sort of stable equilibrium that's reached. Now, this is like the sort of ideal model, mathematical model of how populations grow, but in reality, nature is much messier than this. And we know that sometimes you have good years, sometimes you have bad years, and there's a common thing where populations can overshoot their carrying capacity, and you can really have a lot of animals causing a lot of damage very quickly. And then it sometimes will drop below carrying capacity and go back above. So something just to be familiar with, that populations change over time. Sometimes it can really be a real big problem for a year or two, and then they might sort of not be a problem for a couple of years. So knowing this dynamic and how populations change is important. And let's just emphasize this. Another aspect of deer behavior is that they are considered crepuscular, and that's a fancy word for meaning they're most active in the mornings and evening time. This is a chart from a publication I did using camera traps, actually for black-tailed deer out in California, but white-tailed deer have very similar behaviors. And you see this sort of what we call a bimodal pattern, this two-hump situation. And that's the hours of the day where you see a lot of activity and camera, motion-activated camera pictures being taken in the morning, around 6 or 7 in the morning, and then again around 6 or 7 at night. So again, and quite a bit of activity also overnight. How much do deer eat a day? They eat about 6 to 8% of their body weight daily in terms of wet weight, so fresh green leaves. It's about half of that if you dry the leaves out, but it's about 6 to 8% of their body weight. So a 150-pound deer would be 9 to 12 pounds of green forage a day. And this is a picture of Dr. Steve Damaris out of Mississippi State University, who has gathered plant material to show what that looks like in reality. So this is a single 150-pound deer. Now, smaller deer will eat less and larger deer will eat more, but it gives you a sense for how much they can consume and also how just a single deer can cause an enormous amount of damage in somebody's yard in a short amount of time. Briefly, I'll cover the annual cycle in words, and then I'll show a figure that sums it all up. But I'll start in early November, which is considered the rut, the peak of the breeding season, at least here in Maryland. That might vary by a few weeks here and there, depending where you are in the country. But come February, the bucks lose their antlers. They regrow them every year. May and June is when the does will drop their fawns and give birth to their babies. And June, July, you start hitting this peak lactation period when the mothers are providing the most amount of milk to raise those fawns and have the greatest energy needs. And then come August, September, the buck antlers harden from being in velvet after they've regrown. And then they start this whole cycle over again where they will sharpen those antlers on branches and small trees and saplings and might cause damage there as well. Now, here's that sort of annual cycle shown in a figure and in terms of energy needs. So I think and this is for a female, let's say this is for a female doe, and that's pregnant. And on the bottom, this sort of brownish color on the bottom is sort of what we call maintenance, what a deer needs just to survive and keep alive. Once they breed around November, December, and they start to have their babies coming in this red section. So they're pregnant in this period of red here, and their energy needs slowly increase. Come April, May, their energy needs have probably gone up 15%, maybe 20%. And then come June 1st, late May, early June is when they start to drop their fawns. And you think that might be the time when they eat the most, but no, they will actually, their nutritional needs pop up even further in the early summer, June, July, when they're producing a lot of milk for their fawns. So they're looking at how large this blue section of the chart, it shows that the deer nutritional needs can almost not quite double, but increase by 50 or more percent in this period of time. So this also coincides, and then I'm going to overlay this and think about this in terms of vegetation and landscaping. So we have in the early spring when the deer really, and early summer when the deer really have a lot of needs. And what does that look like when it comes to plants on the landscape? So this is a briefly, I want to focus just on two parts of this graph. On the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, we have this is over the course of the year, where it starts with young leafy plants, and then as they mature and bloom on the right. So you have very small amounts of food in the early spring, and then you have a lot of food available in the late summer on the right as these plants all grow. However, there's this sort of inverse dynamic happening where your crude protein and all your minerals and digestibility are really high in that early springtime, and as these plants mature, a lot of these measures decrease, and other things like fiber and stems, which aren't as digestible, increase. This is another factor to think about on the landscape and what deer are eating and what they want and when they have the most impact. Again, that early spring section when you have these leafy young plants, high crude protein, and you have deer, like we showed right here, I'll back it up, deer with these very highly increased nutritional needs. So you have these periods of time when you can really expect to see a lot of deer moving into new areas and eating a lot of food. So assessing the damage, how you might want to help a landowner figure out what's causing this damage. Now, some of my colleagues have come up with a lot of really great statistically tested methods. If you really want to get deep into this and have a landowner who really wants to know some really strong statistical methods to do this, generally, I think most landscape companies probably aren't going to do this, but I want to present them to you so you can know how it's possible to do it, or explain to a landowner what is possible if they want to have a true ecologically sound way to assess deer damage. But this method, the 10 tallest method by Thomas Rowinski with the Forest Service, you measure annually the height of the 10 tallest trees of a particular species that are less than 5 foot tall on multiple plots over multiple years. Second version of this is AVID. This is Assessing Vegetation Impacts from Deer. They have a website that explains this and has a full manual to describe this. And it involves having 4 to 6 plots of 6 foot radius, 5 or more individuals of a particular species of interest. You tag and measure the height of each of those plants over the course of successive years. Okay. And then third, you could have a sentinel oak method where you actually take and plant containerized plants of red oak and plant them across a landscape, cage half of them, and annually measure the height. So these are all have great manuals to describe how they're done. If you really have somebody who really wants to dig into this, this is sort of some of the gold standard for how you would measure vegetation impacts on deer. But I think as a lot of landowners are going to say, I'm just going to hire you 1 year. I don't want to invest in your expertise for five years to measure deer impacts. I want something easier. A simpler thing that you can just look at with a brief glance and see impacts is a small exclosure. Now here's a small exclosure I've set up, and it's actually too big. Deer will get into this. They will jump into that because it's just a little bit too big, and they're comfortable enough to jump into that. So ideally, you would have this to be less than 10 foot diameter, and a circle works really well, and I'll show you a picture of that. But just at a glance, just by putting up the simple push-in stakes and some wire mesh fence, you can see quickly there's green vegetation inside and much more leaf cover outside. And you really wouldn't know that this is the kind of impact deer are having without putting something like this up. Here's an example of how I would recommend putting up something like this in a circular pattern and about 10 foot diameters as far as you want to go. And you can see in this area the deer have completely destroyed the soybean field, but they won't jump into that exclosure. It's too small. They have difficulty with depth perception to see where the back fence ends and where the front fence ends and the back fence starts. So they just don't quite feel comfortable jumping into it. Another simple technique is to evaluate the forest composition on that property and see, is there all certain types of low preference tree species, in particular like American beech, that are very common in the forest, and you have a low amount of regeneration from high preference species shown here on the left. And these this comes from I have a citation to this, and it must be behind the picture, but that comes from the AVID method by Curtis, Smallage, and Sullivan, I believe. So that's part of the AVID manual handbook, where you can get a picture, get this chart, this table. And the very simplest technique of all, looking at what we call, this is a highly scientific term in ecology, the cultural carrying capacity. When a landowner says, this is just too much, this is, I'm very mad, I've raised these roses for months, and all of a sudden, right when they're on the cusp of blooming, the next day, the deer come in and eat every single flower off the top of my rose plants, and you know then that you have a problem. So this might be the probably simplest and easiest technique, and probably the one you will hear from first as a landscaping company trying to offer services to a landowner. So now shifting into approaches for mitigating deer damage. And so this will cover the bulk of the talk, of the rest of the talk, and we're going to cover something called integrative pest management. So you see this figure at the right, and it has four main components: vegetation management, fencing, repellent, and population management, which oftentimes involves lethal methods and lethal control. So we're going to start with vegetation management, because the foundation of all of the tree of life, of the biomass on the planet, comes from our vegetation. So and this is where we can have a lot of influence. So delving back to this image of our idealized image of a landowner who has a few different types. It's an 8-acre property, and they have some mowed lawn and everything else. And we have these goals here on the left. And they describe they have less lawn to mow. They want less lawn to mow. We can think about how wet might fit into deer management. And I bolded a few things, and managing, controlling invasive plants. So we can think about maybe hitting two birds with one stone on that one. Reducing deer impacts, and that can be a lot of different things. And finally, I tagged in there the bolded the section on improving habitat for songbirds and pollinators. This can also be folded into some of the aspects that might not be directly applicable for deer management, but something I think fits into that broader wildlife category that a lot of landowners are interested in. So vegetation management tools, I've broken this up into four main categories. So, and we'll go through each of these. So you'll see all these repeated again. So the first is unpalatable plants. Second is preferred plants. Third is that pollinator grassland or shrubland, bird habitat and pollinator habitat. And finally, talk a little bit about forest openings. So these are sort of the suite of different options that you could do for managing vegetation and for a landowner to try to manipulate and manage the deer problem. We have a couple of great unpalatable plants lists in Maryland. I am sure that Pennsylvania and other states nearby, your state probably also has a list, if you have deer problems in your state, have lists of local plants that are resistant to deer feeding. So at the end of this presentation, I will share these two links, so you don't have to write them down. I'll put them in the chat. But one is from Extension and one is from our local Department of Natural Resources. There's a lot of overlap. I'll briefly show you. It's a lot to take in, but being familiar with these resources, bringing a copy of these with you to a consultation with a landowner really shows you've done your homework. You know the plant species that will work and that can help remedy some of these problems. This is from the DNR source that I listed just in the last slide, and it has both native and non-native plants, but the bolded plants are native to Maryland. And so if you're Many landowners might, if they're particularly ecologically minded, they might really want to focus on native plants. So these would be ones to focus on as well. And these are, again, plants that are resistant to deer grazing that you could oftentimes might have some horticultural or ornamental values and would work well for a landowner. Next, we have a variety of flowers and ferns as well. Now, I'll pause and say not all of these are perfect. Deer preferences vary by region. They vary over time. They vary by the individual animal. So just like humans, deer have personalities, and some might like some things and not like other things. So, for example, I saw in here we have flowering dogwood. I know our dogwood, a newly planted dogwood, was completely decimated and defoliated by deer. So again, this isn't a full. You might still have problems, but these are some examples where you might have more luck than others. So that's the sort of deer resistant option, and then there's the attraction or diversion option. Now, this is a little tricky. I'm doing some work in an agricultural context on how to divert deer using soybeans, using forage soybeans that is designed for grazing and to be highly palatable for livestock, generally for dairy cows, but they're also highly palatable for deer. So this is, again, it cuts both ways, because by planting things that will attract deer, you're also increasing the capacity of your environment to support more deer. So you're kind of increasing that carrying capacity level. So instead of your environment only supporting 20 deer, now it might be able to support 25 deer, because you're planting all these great nutritious legumes and forbs and grasses for them. So I think I share this as a way to think about managing deer in terms of attracting them to places where you want them. I think there is some value in diversion on our agricultural areas. Anecdotally, we're trying to measure this quantitatively right now in our second year of a study, but anecdotally, farmers seem to think this is actually helping to keep deer out of their prime agricultural crops and into other areas where they plant preferred forages. So there's a great guide that Dr. Craig Harper at the University of Tennessee has put together. It's a landowner's guide for wildlife food plots. He has a variety of other publications as well, but this goes into a lot of detail for a lot of different, the nuance and the details that you can do. But this is a service that a landscaping company, a really unique aspect if you're looking to expand your offerings to landowners. This kind of thing might be, and it's a niche that you want to get into. A lot of landowners, especially those that have hunting or desire better hunting, this would be something that would be of high interest to those folks. Briefly, there's three main categories of food plots, and I'll just briefly mention some of the highlighted ones. You have cool season perennials. These are plants that tend to grow best oftentimes you plant them in the fall, and they really start to come up early spring. Right about now, they're about to start popping, and they produce a lot of forage in the late spring and early summer, and then they go more dormant in the hottest months of the summer. But clovers are classic. The picture I had here before, these are all crimson clovers and with the red flowers. These are Austrian winter peas, which I'll show you in a second where they fit in. And then I believe this is winter wheat, the tall, grassy-looking plants. So the cool season perennials, we have cool season annuals. These come up quickly and grow pretty well. Oats, wheat, winter pea, brassicas like turnips and rape and radish. They will also provide feed in this cooler seasons and in the winter. And then you have warm season plants. Soybeans are probably the number one plant for attracting deer to an area. They might not survive if you plant a very small number of them and have a lot of deer. They will be eaten down to the ground and will not survive. So you have to they're that attractive. So, but a lot of other plants, corn, cowpeas, lab, American joint vetch, these are all plants that will work in the summer. American joint vetch is a native. It's the only native, I believe, on this list. So, and it's more tolerant of that deer grazing and won't be eaten down and totally destroyed in a lot of cases, unlike soybeans. So happy to go into more detail on all this. This resource is really good as well if you want to dig into more yourself. Briefly talk a little bit about native meadow, grasslands, and shrublands. In terms of the landowner goal for wanting to reduce their mowing, they have a cool season pasture in that bottom right corner of the picture, if you remember. And that's something that the cool season pastures tend to not provide nearly as good wildlife habitat as, especially for a lot of our native birds and grassland birds in decline, as a native warm season grass would. So again, there's another publication. I'm really impressed with the guys at the University of Tennessee. They've put out a lot of great publications. I aspire to, at the end of my career, to have as good a body of work as they've done over there. Really recommend their work. It's highly detailed and gives you a lot of good data for the nuance involved in managing warm season grasses and establishing them. And they're a little tricky. We've got a study going on right now on how to establish them with different techniques, and happy to talk with anybody interested in this aspect as well. And another way you can sell this, again, this is getting a little bit off of deer management, but for those landowners that really are attracted to wildlife, want to maintain and reduce impacts to wildlife, here's a chart for something you can share with them. At least here in Maryland, the bird declines by habitat are listed here. These are the top 20 declining bird species in the state of Maryland over the last 50 years, with the top declining species being that northern bobwhite, and then moving down from there. And in green, all those green bars are birds that really rely on or need or use a lot of what we call early succession habitat, that grassland, shrublands, and young forest habitat. So 9 of the top 10 species on this list really like that grassland habitat and early succession habitat. Particular native warm season grasses, these perennial grasses that have bunches and provide habitat for these birds. So something you can bring to landowners in your consultations to show them that you're familiar with some of the ecology of the area in terms of birds and songbirds and what's needed in terms of helping their populations. They have a cool season pasture that's old. It's probably not being used for livestock. Something you could renovate into a warm season grassland that would benefit a variety of bird species. I encourage you to look towards your local NRCS office. NRCS stands for Natural Resource Conservation Service. They have great resources, great employees who will help you out. They can come up with seed mixes for you and put you in touch with native plant nurseries. I can also help you with contacts for native plant nurseries where you could get seeds for pollinators and things like this. But here's an example of a seed mix we are putting in at the Y Research and Education Center right now. Okay, we're doing good. This is a great chart. It shows the flowering period. A lot of these are forbs that are flowering over different times of the year. And this is really great to make sure for those pollinators that you're providing flowering nectar throughout the whole summer. So through a different variety of species. And the last vegetation management piece we'll talk about is forest openings and forest management. And I have this picture here, some satellite imagery, where you can see, at least it's a little blurry, but here this top area has a lot thinner amounts of trees, and creating forest openings in large blocks of forest. Again, it cuts both ways, like with planting palatable food plots. It might increase the carrying capacity of your landscape, so more deer can grow and they can increase and fill that gap by creating a forest opening. However, a forest opening can help to potentially, if you do enough of them and have enough forage, you can maybe provide more feed than the deer need for a year, and they would rather be in the forest than out in the open, and it might help to reduce damage, especially around a household that's out in the open. If they have food in the forest, they much prefer to be in cover of forested areas while they're grazing. So looking at all these different aspects as part of your holistic plan for how you might want to approach a landowner for ways to manage deer on their property. And I put on here, work with a forester on this. They would give you good advice on how big you might want your forest openings to be, the types of trees you might want to remove, and things like that. So in sum, I want to come back to this and think about our vegetation management on this landscape, but we see this mowed lawn area on the top right. Let's say, for example, the landowner is a hunter and would like to do more hunting. You could reduce this mowing. You could put in a food plot here of clovers to attract deer to an area where they would be able to view them. That might be of interest. They'd want to see the deer, but also want to keep them away from the house. So putting preferred food further down in this mowed area might keep those deer down there. Again, need to be paired probably with other aspects to keep them from just simply their population growing to be even more larger and continuing the problem. This bottom right area, you could put in that warm season grass, and the forest openings on the left you could put in. But just wanted to revisit this and think about how you would manage the vegetation in different ways given those vegetation management topics. Sorry about that, that was reversed. But the second topic, we covered vegetation management. Now we're going to shift over to fencing and what we can do, different approaches for fencing to manage deer. There's a lot of different ways to do it. One of the simplest things is just fencing out individual trees or individual plants. And there's a lot of ways you can do it. You can use mesh, you can use wire. Here on the bottom left is actually beaver damage and how you can keep beavers from taking out large mature trees if you're near a waterway. Here in the middle is my favorite preferred use is using these white stakes are actually called step-in stakes. They're used for electric fences. They're nice. They have a little tab here at the bottom. You push your foot on and there's a stake at the bottom. It drives it right into the ground. No hammer required. It goes in real easy. It takes you just a couple of seconds. They're lightweight and they help create a lot of visibility so you can see these exclosures as well, which is they can kind of disappear in the landscape if you don't have some stakes that make it apparent that they're there. This is around that dogwood that I was mentioning earlier that got completely defoliated, and it's slowly recovering this year. Plastic mesh is another option. Here's our home and garden center, John Trounfield, describing one of these plastic mesh fences and how these can be effective as well. This is a tall one. This is an 8-foot tall plastic mesh fencing, and this will work as well. It helps to keep it taut at the bottom and the top, oftentimes with a wire to keep deer from going under, or the top of the plastic sort of folding down. There's a lot of different ways you can approach this, but here's another example of how to put that up in a forested environment. If you're looking to have improved forest understory, there's a great publication out of Cornell that describes a lot of different designs. This is a picture from that publication here that shows how you can not damage trees. You can keep certain trees and use those as fence posts. It saves you money from having to put in posts yourself or buy posts, and you're really limited to just the plastic mesh, which can be pretty inexpensive. This wire here at the top that is strung through and keeps it up at the top, and a wire at the bottom as well. The next step up, and this gets to be quite expensive, but if you have a garden, if your landowner has a garden area that they do not want deer in no matter what, and they're willing to invest in that, and this is a long-term project for them, investing in a high tensile wire mesh fence that's 8 feet tall will create a relatively permanent structure of fencing that will do a good job for them in most cases. Deer can jump over these. A lot of the aspect of fencing to think about is a rancher once told me, he was a buffalo rancher, and I asked him how much trouble he had keeping his buffaloes inside the fence. And he said, well, the best fence is to have good forage and good water inside the fenced area. to keep his buffalo in. So if there's resources, in this case it's reversed. If there's resources, food and water outside the fence, the deer aren't going to have a lot of motivation to want to jump something like this. They certainly can, especially if driven by hunger and they see a lot of food inside. They can certainly do that. But again, it's pretty rare. The next type of fencing you can get into is electric fencing. Baiting, this has been mentioned by others, but baiting the electric fence with peanut butter or some scent attractants. So a deer will go up to that fence and sniff it or lick it and get a shock and realize and be trained on that fence and realize what's going on. And that's important because a deer might just jump into it, run over it, get tangled up in it, and sort of knock the whole thing over if they're not really trained about that this is something that they want to stay away from. So that's an important aspect of putting up electric fences. These can be relatively inexpensive in terms of costs, but in terms of maintenance, they can be a lot more. You have to watch them and watch out for shorting of the electrical currents and things like that. But it's certainly an option to think about. And if you want to go to the next level, and again, this is possibly more in that realm of a landowner who really wants to invest and make sure they do not get deer in an area. This is pretty effective. It's two tiers of electric fencing, and again, this plays on that problem of deer have of not having great three-dimensional vision. Their eyes, as prey species, their eyes are placed in the side of their head, so they have this great wide range of vision, but they don't have a lot of binocular vision in the front. So they have difficulty judging distances for how far to jump. So when you put in a second tier like this, it makes them very wary to not really understand how far they have to jump to get over this fenced area. Again, more investment in time and equipment to put something up and space to put a second tier in. But this does work pretty well. And there's a link here at the bottom that you can go to learn about this. And finally, the last part of our fencing section will be on individual tree shelters. And again, this is briefly mentioned in my colleague's publication on low-cost fence designs. There's a variety of different types of tree shelters. So if you're going to do a reforestation project and you have individual trees that you want to put up and you want to really encourage them to grow upward, like you see in this picture, these can be effective approaches as well. So again, coming back to these this example, fencing I think could be most useful, especially around the house. If there's certain areas, if there's a garden area that they want to keep deer out of, you have a variety of different options for how to keep deer out of the garden. You have individual specimen trees you want to make sure aren't browsed down. Individual plantings can also be useful there. And of course, if you want to encourage some regeneration in the woods, you can use some of these other larger scale approaches of fencing as well. And we are now going to turn towards repellents. Repellents are an interesting tool in the toolbox. Again, you might need to use all four of these at some point or depending on the circumstances, but repellents are another tool in the toolbox to use. We have University of Maryland Extension has a fact sheet on using commercial deer repellents and how well it works on different types of bushes in the landscape. My colleague Jonathan Kays published this a few years ago, and it goes into a lot of detail about how it works best. And you can see right here, these 5 items right here: low to moderate deer pressure, light to moderate feeding damage, small acreage, repellents aren't being used elsewhere. And then finally, if there's no alternative, if there is alternative food sources available elsewhere, because if the deer get hungry enough, they will hold their nose and eat things despite a repellent being there. This is a recent presentation at the Wildlife Damage Management Conference last year, and it shows the efficacy over time of repellents. And they do work quite well up to about 18, 20 days or so. You can see 5, 6 different brands used here, and all of them were almost 100% effective in reducing deer damage until about day 26 to 38, when it starts to drop off. The control here is this gray, and you can see that the damage is far less for these different colored options at the top. But at this sort of period, around day 26 to 38, you have a very distinct difference where their effectiveness drops off over time. So it's the kind of thing that you could use on a small scale. It does require reapplication every 2 to 4 weeks to keep deer off of the areas. So another home remedy repellent that has worked very well actually on some of our research farms. One of our research farms uses Irish Spring soap and a cheese grater to keep deer out of plots. And he swears by it. He's been using it for years, and he walks with his soap and grates it around the perimeter of areas of research plots where he doesn't want deer to go into. Again, he's in an environment where there is feed elsewhere, and when presented with some sort of repellent like this, they would rather just go across the road to a local farmer's soybean plot than to go past this Irish Spring soap. So this has been described by many as very effective, little home remedy and inexpensive as well. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the last topic we'll cover, which is population management. I'd like to briefly touch on, and when I say population management, oftentimes that involves lethal control. There is interest in non-lethal birth control methods, but those are as of today highly expensive and not feasible for most any individual landowner. There are problems in terms of there are a lot of problems. I'm happy to go into it, but they're just currently not really viewed as effective. But if anybody has questions about it, we can get into it in the Q&A. But hunting, some people might have concerns or problems or worries about hunting. Is this ethical? Is this just right? Animal rights concerns. And I like to just tell a little bit of the history of hunting in our country. Is that market hunting in the 1800s, 1700s to 1800s led to precipitous declines in a lot of our wildlife species. But the hunters themselves, when they saw such declines, several leaders in that community stood up and actually became some of the leading conservationists of the time, and especially people like Theodore Roosevelt, who created our national forest system, a very avid hunter, but also somebody who helped to preserve large areas to maintain wildlife on the landscape so he could continue to do hunting as well. Hunting currently funds 99% of Maryland's Department of Natural Resources through hunting license fees, as well as taxes on firearms and ammunition. So hunting is really key to the conservation model in North America and funds a lot of our game agencies across the nation. I think it's probably fair to say it funds the majority, probably the vast majority of our state wildlife agencies across the whole country. If you're going to implement a hunting program, it is really important to think of a couple of items. If you're not familiar with hunting and are new to it, I'd like to just share a couple of brief tips. One is elevated stands are a great tool, especially here in the East. There's a safety component to that in that you are shooting downward, so projectiles tend to go into the ground and increases safety because of that. It helps to reduce your scent because you're up high and it gets dispersed into the air faster. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of scent control. If you're going to have a hunting program, deer can smell you long before they can see you, and if the wind is not in the right direction, they won't come anywhere near a tree stand, even if you are elevated, especially if the deer are wise and are under any sort of hunting pressure. Like to also say safety first in terms of elevated stands. In terms of hunting safety, more people are injured or die from falling out of trees than from getting shot from any sort of firearm injury. So there are a variety of tools, of techniques available, in particular, full body harnesses or harnesses of some kind that are approved and that are tether the hunter to the tree. I think it's just not worth. I've met too many people who have fallen out of tree stands and had their back broken. I've heard of people who have broken their backs, and of course there have been people who have died. Every year people die from falling out of trees. It's just not worth it. So really recommend everybody encourage the use of safety harnesses and when they're hunting out of trees. Something else to consider with implementing a hunting program is consider the use of shooting lanes. Here's an example of you could place a hunting stand in the middle of this three-way hunting lane. Deer, again, the evenings, mornings and evenings, will come out to feed in these open areas, especially if you put preferred food plots in these areas. They'll come out to graze, and it helps to make for a more effective hunting program. There are a lot of resources available if people don't know how to hunt. You can share these with landowners. They might think, well, I don't know anything about hunting. I've never hunted in my life. Is this okay? There are a lot of different opportunities to teach them about it, teach them the role of hunting in conservation, teach them how hunting can be performed sustainably and not cause any damage to the species, populations. There are hunter education classes. There are programs tailored towards how to become an outdoors woman here in Maryland and elsewhere. There are mentored hunt programs that will bring people out for their first hunt and train them on these things. So, and a lot of states have programs like this, and these are a variety of ones that are available in Maryland. Encourage you to look at your local programs that are available as well that you could share with the landowner, looking at how to control deer damage. Some more research you can do in the background, have in your back pocket, is being familiar with deer damage management programs in your state. I've highlighted a couple of here. Maryland has deer management permits that opens up harvest of deer year-round, especially for antlerless deer, which impacts population growth the most. Pennsylvania has a couple of programs. They have a deer management assistance program and agricultural deer control program. Again, these loosen up restrictions and make it easier to harvest more animals and be more effective on reducing populations. Now, hunting alone might not, you might still have damage on your property. There are a variety of ways you can try to maximize your take through hunting. I'm happy to talk about that, but deer will go nocturnal if you hunt them in the wrong way and you let them wise up to how your hunting operation is going. So in closing, I'd like to kind of wrap this whole thing up into bring it back to this whole thing, and this is our second to last slide or so. But think about how you might come to this property with all we talked about in this presentation and how to go about this. So around the house and garage, you might want to use targeted plant fencing or garden fencing that we described. You could offer to a landowner a service of providing repellent on a monthly basis on their flower beds or on non-edible foods to keep deer out of these areas. You could, if planting trees, you could use tree shelters especially around this riparian zone. Food plots or diversion crops could go down here on the middle, and down here you could renovate that old cool season grass into a warm season native grassland or shrubland with pollinator values. Over in your forested areas, you could open them up, work with a forester to thin those, manage those forests, remove less desirable trees, open up more understory sunlight getting to the forest floor to encourage more vegetative growth. You can put in shooting lanes to increase the efficacy of your hunting program, along with elevated stands with a safety harness to also make it more effective in hunting. So to wrap it up, I would like to encourage everybody to think a little bit and bring with them a little bit of understanding and knowledge of the animals that they're dealing with in the habitat. Again, I'll emphasize it again. Objectives are really important in the landowners, how they're going to go forward. And there are a variety of tools, and some will work better than others depending on the circumstances. I think what I've shared here hopefully gives you some opportunities to share your knowledge to your clientele and to hopefully gain and enhance your business and new business opportunities. In particular with fencing, repellents, specialty plantings, deer-resistant plants, deer-preferred plants through wildlife food plots, and pollinator habitat. So with that, I want to say thank you. Appreciate it. This QR code you can pull up with your phone and if you put it on your camera app and just hold it up there, it should bring up a link. You can go to this, they'll take you to a website, this one listed here, and you can fill out a feedback evaluation form. Point out what you liked, what you didn't like, things you would have liked to have heard of more, things you could have used less on. Here's my contact information at the bottom, lukemac@umd.edu. Happy to take any questions now. Feel free to email me afterwards if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Great, Luke. That was really informative. Thank you for that. You gave some nice spins on stuff and taking care of us with that safety information there too about the hunting in the trees. That was great. Thanks for that good reminder of making sure we're safe. So there has been a few questions coming up, and Joe, if you could come in here too, because there are a few questions here. I really like, Joe, how you gave us that number of 35 trees per acre with 35-foot spacing. So remembering to everybody that Joe talked about chosen tree or crop tree method. So can you remind us again of that technique? The 35, that relationship between 30, yeah.
Yeah, so it's really simple. There's 43,560 square feet in an acre. 35 trees per acre works out to a 35 by 35 foot spacing. So whatever 35 times 35 is times 35 is 43,560. So that roughly 35 foot spacing is 35 trees per acre. If we said we're going to do a half a chain spacing to our foresters out there, and remember a chain is 66 feet, half a chain is 33 feet, that gets you closer to 40 trees per acre. So just that 2-foot difference in spacing makes a big difference in number of trees per acre. So that's why when we do this, we're always going to say we're going to shoot for roughly 30 to 40 trees per acre and go for about a half a chain spacing.
Half a chain spacing for me would probably be about 7 paces. Usually for a chain, it's that 66 is about, for me, it's 15 paces, and a paces is not a step, just to kind of put that in everybody's mind. A pace is different than a step. What's your pace for a chain?
It's 12 on flat ground, 12 and a half on a slope.
There we go. Okay. So if we're wanting to do half a chain, you can practice that with getting you can measure that out. That's something we do in 4-H. It's a lot of fun.
Right. Yep.
I wanted to let everybody know before we move on with the questions is I put the link to the form. Remember at the beginning, I said to get your continuing education credits, you have to fill out the form to get the certificate. Everybody, I have put the link in the chat. So if you are looking to get continuing education credits, please click on the link that's in the chat. That will lead you to a form to get your certificate. And then once you get that certificate in your email, you can send that to the association that you would like to send it to. Okay, I'll remind us again throughout this question. Joe, don't leave yet. I got one more question. And this was a really good one because I also had the same question, and I'm glad you answered it. It was answered already in the Q&A, but I wanted to just hear you say it too. How many sides of the tree do you recommend freeing up? So we've picked our intermediate tree. That's the recommendation, I understand. And how much space is given? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I neglected to say how many sides of the tree need released. At least 3 sides of the tree's crown need released in order to see a benefit and to see a growth response. 4 sides is better. I would tell you that if you are spending the time finding the crop trees, finding the chosen trees, and walking to them with a saw, you should go ahead and release all 4 sides while you're there. it really doesn't take any more time. As far as how released it needs to be, how much space around the crown, it really just needs to not be touching the tree next to it. So the standard that we started with here in Virginia is at least 1 foot of space around the crown. So if there's a 1 foot gap between the crown of your chosen tree and the next tree, then you don't need to cut the next tree. I had initially started down the path of saying a 6 foot gap. Well, that means that if you have a 4 foot gap and then you cut the next tree and that tree has an 8 foot wide crown, you just went to a 12 foot gap, which is huge. And we do want to, for the purpose of crop tree release and younger stands, we want to still have some competition in the canopy for these trees to help promote their vertical growth and prevent them from growing outwards too much in the crown and developing an open crown form, because these are forest. We still want these to be forest grown trees and not open grown yard trees. We also, for any future timber crop purposes, want to prevent epicormic branching on the stem. So we want to prevent too much sunlight from hitting the trunk of the crop trees. We started with a 1 foot space around the crown of the tree. And if the crowns are touching or within that 1 foot, then you cut the next tree and you might end up with a 4, 6, or 8 foot gap on that side, which can take some time for that to close in.
Yeah, that was great. I thank you for reminding us of that. You know, you brought up some good numbers, 35 trees per acre, 35 foot spacing, and then opening up 3. So we got a lot of number 3s. You know, if we want to remember, it's kind of 3, 4, 5, 35 feet, 35 foot spacing, and 3 to 4.
3 to 4 sides of the crown.
Yes, sir.
I'd say the only real reason to not release the 4th side of the crown is if there's a good reason to not cut that tree over there. We don't encourage picking crop trees adjacent to each other, but I guess there could certainly be a situation where that happens. It could be that the tree on the 4th side poses some hazard to fall or something like that you would rather not cut it for a safety purpose. But for the most part, you should be releasing 4 sides of the tree.
And somebody also asked another question that I said, and you answered it nicely. So you don't necessarily have to go in great detail. You answered it in the Q&A. So if people want more detail on his answer, but what to do with those trees once they're felled. We've cut down our 3 or 4 trees around our chosen tree. And then what are we doing with that? And, some of the comments in the chat was, even leaving some of that for some of the, insects and stuff in the forest. What are your suggestions for that? Just a quick, because you gave a very detailed answer in the Q&A. Just wanted to do a quick overview of that.
Short version is you can do whatever you want. It really doesn't matter. You can build a brush pile. You can leave it there to rot. You could extract it for firewood. If they're large enough and you want to extract for a commercial use, you can do that. But you don't want to do anything that causes damage to your crop tree in the process of extracting the tree that was cut. But there's no problem with letting it lay there and rot. There's also no need for the forest to cut a low stump. You can be cutting the trees at a high stump and leaving it that way. For aesthetics purposes, your client wants it cut all the way down, you can do that. Beautiful thing about that is, and cutting it instead of using herbicide, is if it resprouts, or the trees that you cut, if they're alive, they're going to resprout, and that will be browse for deer or anything else that wants to come by and eat them.
Good point. Good point. And, I just did a mushroom inoculation thing. You can inoculate some of those logs once you cut them down with some native mushrooms there. Some lion's mane would be great with a little Old Bay. You got yourself almost a little crab dip right there.
There you go.
Okay. So some of the other, I really liked the question of when we're choosing our tree, even choosing it for pollination purposes. Wow. That's opening our mind to thinking about aesthetics and wildlife in a different way, because we know that Many of the bugs like to live around here and birds like to eat them. So having these pollinators, that was great conversation happening in the chat there. Luke, so I might bounce back, you guys. Okay, so Luke, you mentioned something really interesting about deer, and they don't have any top teeth. Hey, that is very interesting, very interesting. And
I'm also thinking we have some questions on the question and answer session. Should I address
yes,
those?
we do.
I was typing them, but I thought I could just talk them out.
Yes, I hope so too.
Mamma Mia.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sure.
It's I'll read it out loud. It says, I've had deer cut plastic mesh with their hooves. And another attendee also said later, do you find that plastic deer fencing breaks down quickly and then cracks and crumbles when attempted to be removed? Those are kind of the same topics, so I'll try to maybe touch on them briefly. I think, yeah, plastic is probably not as permanent as wire fencing. The advantage is that it's just so much cheaper. And so you can get it up, it's lighter weight, and you can put up for a fraction of the cost. So there are trade-offs with all these things. Mama Mia also asked, how do you prevent deer from rubbing antlers on trees? And I didn't have a slide on this.
Question.
But yeah, I think one of those wire mesh fences around the tree would probably help solve that problem. And then I see Thomas Scotsbarger said, how many deer can 63 acres support? Gosh, I've done a study on deer populations, and I'll say I hate answering questions about like how many deer, and I'll tell you why. I hate it because it's so difficult to say. And I'll just sort of describe to you how deer move on the landscape and why it's so hard to answer this question. So like a doe, they estimate a doe's population, a home range, which is not a static thing. There's not boundaries, but they tend to live their lives in a range of about 100 acres, maybe let's say about 100 acres. And that kind of depends on a lot of things, but maybe 150 acres. A buck can live have a home range of 600 or 1,000 acres. And some bucks will travel hundreds of miles in the course of a year. So you have this crazy amount of movement from animals and variation between how they behave. You mix that with the fact that some of them are herding up, and so they have these sort of home ranges that, you know, they'll all kind of move together, but then you'll have some disperse off. You have all this sort of dynamic shifting. So and moving off and seasonally coming in and coming out. So it's really hard to say. I would say 63 acres, like I said, a doe's home range is 100 acres. So you've got deer that are already moving on and off your property. So if you fenced it, gosh, we could probably come up with an estimate for if you fenced your 63 acres, how many it could support. And I'd have to really think about it for a little bit. But in practical terms, it's very hard to sort of say. I mean, generally, I think our parks try to get below 20 deer a square mile for densities. And I know I've heard foresters say getting deer below 8 deer a square mile is preferred for forest regeneration, which is such a low density that hunting it's going to be very difficult to hunt deer at those low populations. It's going to take a lot of time unless you're using permits that will allow harvest at night or things like that. So which depends on the state. It's possible certain states allow it, but without that, it would be hard to get much lower than that. But there are places that estimate their deer population as 60 deer per square mile. So, and again, I always hold these numbers with a grain of salt because the dynamics, the numbers are changing, the animals are moving. There's no fixed lines for where, like if a deer steps into this property, does that mean it's part of the population or not? So it's very sort of dynamic situation when you try to measure density of deer on an area. So I'll stop there.
Well,
I wanted to answer that. That
ahead.
63 acre property will support a half a deer per year.
A half a deer per year.
Yeah, because it's not going to be able to live its whole year on that 63 acre property, and so on average it'd be a half a deer.
Good point. Good point. Good point. So the shooting lanes, you mentioned the shooting lanes, and what a great example of a forester and a wildlifer working together. The forester can help create those shooting lanes. They're a great thing. There's a Eastern Shore person here who has their shooting lanes, and they have apple trees and fruit trees to bring those in. So great relationship with the wildlifer and the forester. So here's another one in the chat here, you guys. I recently had to remove an 80-foot color fir from my yard because it cracked at the base. That tree company used a huge crane for the work, and they took 3 long trunk sections to a company to turn them into lumber. Is there a way for a property owner to benefit financially in this situation? I paid $3,500 to the tree company. That's what this person mentioned. Is there a way that a property owner could have financially benefited from that particular situation? What do you think?
Yeah, my first thought was that would be great. And in some places that might be happening, but that's not the way that the forest products industry is built. There are certainly local markets where that kind of thing might happen. And my hope is that there are people on this webinar that are going to work that kind of thing into their business model. My second thought was I looked at the prices again and the equipment that you said they used, a huge crane. Sounds to me like you did benefit from them taking that and taking some value or some money out of the price for the value of those logs. $3,500 to bring in a crane to remove a tree sounds like a pretty good price to me. Without the value of those logs, it might have been $4,000 or $4,500. So you might ask the tree company about that. Overall, there's the value in logs is in volume. Individual logs don't hold a great deal of value until you get into some real specialty stuff, which ends up taking a lot of time and energy to market. And some people can do that and some can't. But if they just if a logger cut a yellow poplar tree down in your yard that was a 24 inch diameter tree, wow, a couple of logs, and took that to a sawmill around here, they may get $300 for that. But it's going to, if somebody has to climb the tree and deal with the top and all the rest of the material that doesn't go to the sawmill, that's a $1,500 job without a crane. So your benefit to that as the landowner is less out of pocket cost if they're going to merchandise the bole of that tree.
Well said. Well said. I wish I could have recorded that to have that for whenever a landowner calls me, because that is a big question. And that's a big question. People think that one log can go to the mill just like that. So it is an interesting question. All right, I wanted to remind everybody just one more time that the link for the form to get your continuing education credit certificate is in the chat, and please click on that link to be able to get it and to be able to fill out that form. Okay, there's another question in the Q&A. Is tulip tree the same as yellow poplar? Yes. It's not a poplar tree, ... So interesting. This is a great question. Tulip tree, yellow poplar, is it the same as a poplar? So give us the word here, Joe.
Yeah. Tulip tree and yellow poplar is the same thing. They're synonymous. This is the problem with using common names, which we all do. They're both Liriodendron tulipifera. It is not a poplar. That's why when you see yellow poplar written, it really should be hyphenated. The correct way to write that common name is hyphenated. Most people don't bother to do that, including me. It is not a poplar, such as a northern hardwoods popple or poplar, which is aspen. Generally big tooth or generally quaking aspen, but could be big tooth aspen.
Okay, so yes, good clarification. Somebody mentioned here, and good point. I thought of this point when you were talking about spraying versus marking the tree with flagging. So this person brought up a point. A lot of times sawmills will not take residential trees due to nails and other metal that could be inside.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just didn't get that far in the explanation, but there's a lot of reasons to not take residential and yard trees. I actually had a tree that cut down in my yard, and several years ago, finally cut up the logs and cut through buckshot with my chainsaw, split the piece on the along that growth ring, and found all the bird shot in it. That probably would not have been a big problem for the sawmill, but if that had been a nail or a fence or something like that, it would be a problem.
That would have been a big problem. Well, I'm glad you're safe. Okay, we got another question here. Any advice, you guys, or insight on setting up silvopasture, grazing livestock in woodland settings? This is a beautiful thing if you've seen it. Cows in West Virginia, I've seen that with beautiful cows in the woodland setting. What are you guys' thoughts on silvopasture?
I will gladly start that. I have thoughts on just about everything, especially relating to trees. My thoughts on silvopasture are it can be great. It is difficult to manage well, and it has to be very closely managed and monitored so there isn't damage to the trees. You're going to get less grass production generally than if you didn't have the trees, I believe. Every time I talk to a farmer and many extension agents about it, I find out about another tree livestock conflict. Like, you can't plant this because it's going to kill your cow. And so there's a lot of things to consider there. I'm a forester, so when I talk silvopasture, I want to plant trees into fields, and I have good reasons for it. Every farmer, rancher that I've talked to that want to do that, and many of the ag extension agents want to thin forest and plant grass and put cows in that forest. So in order to do it on a sustainable kind of recurring manner, you may have to do both. If you're going to thin your forest and plant grass to put cows in it or put livestock in it, then you'd better plant some trees in your fields, your existing fields, so that when all the trees die in the forest from compaction on the roots and lack of water because the grass that wasn't there before, the grass started taking all the water. When those trees die, you have trees growing up in your fields in order to take over that silvopasture form. There are, I've seen many times where people have thinned or cut their forest, planted grass, and grazed it, and within 10 years, most of the trees that they left died. Wow. Because if those trees are getting up there in years, upwards of 60 years old, then they grew up on a forest soil with that level of compaction, with the amount of competition they had around them. And when you thin that way down and then put livestock on it, and plant grass on it, those are settings that those trees didn't grow in. Their root system isn't set up for it and used to it, and they're going to start having problems, and eventually they die. Okay. They die sooner. Of course, they're going to eventually die, but they die sooner than you had expected them to. When you plant trees into a field, the root system develops in a compacted setting, develops with the competition with grass, and then they'll last much longer.
Good point. Good point. Luke, when that question came up, I thought of some of the things that you even just said in your presentation. So what are your thoughts on silvopasture?
Silvopastoralism. Yeah. Well, I've done a little bit of work on this. My previous position is out in California. I actually was a range management master's student years ago at Berkeley, and did some work in Spain. And Spain has a very interesting pig-based silvopastoral system that's integrated with their what they call the oak dehesas, which are sort of acorn-based pig grazing systems. And if you've ever heard of jamón ibérico, which is this like premium ham product out of Spain, there are people trying to do that here in the United States. I've got some I was working with some folks in California who are doing it out there, and there are folks in North Carolina that have done it. So that's a different. I think a lot of people think of livestock probably as like cows or goats, but that's one species, and there's a lot that goes into it. There's a whole like book of information that's actually available. You can email me and I can send you the link to it on how to set those things up. I think it sounds like Joe had a lot of good insights on these issues. So I can't speak anymore on like the particularities for that. But one thing I will say that might be nice is that, you know, we talked about early succession habitat and grazing, you know, possibly in some certain circumstances, especially like a savanna environment, grazing being a tool in the toolbox to keep early succession habitat in place as a way to kind of slow down that process of a movement from a grassland to a mature forest. So there's so many, especially bird species that are kind of in decline, that grazing, I think, it's very complex. It depends on a lot of different factors about how much and how they will slow down succession. But generally speaking, they will slow the transition of a field, of an open field or a savanna, from being filled in with saplings. It'll slow that process down significantly. So if you're already set up with a savanna and the trees can handle this and aren't going to die, like Joe was mentioning, I think it could be a nice tool to keep an open sort of park-like setting without having to mow and use those kind of labor tools. So.
Great, you guys, good. And I just want to clarify, it was pigs that were eating the acorn type things in Spain. Is that what pigs? Okay, just wanted to clarify.
Pigs. Yeah, they have special grades of ham that are on how much they were finished on acorns in an open field setting. So if they were finished on acorns exclusively for I think at least 2 months, they have standards. Then the meat takes on the nutty characteristics of the acorns.
Wow.
And is highly prized as it's $100 a pound
Wow.
is the price for the jamon. So the Spaniards have developed it. It's a very large acreage, extensive process. You need a lot of acres to have enough acorns to feed a bunch of pigs and to fatten them. But it's a very interesting process. If you ever had to go to Spain, it's fun.
It sounds like a trip to Spain for those people that are interested in silvopasture. If you were thinking of going on that vacation you didn't take in 2020, 2021, maybe Spain can be your trip and get some work done. And hey, I don't want to speak for Luke, but he knows his stuff in Spain. You know, I'm just saying, if you need a chaperone there. Any other thoughts or questions, y'all? I see that we're getting a lot of thank you, learned lots of information, and I'm going to guess that as people are leaving, they're clicking on that link to get their CEU. Yes, I'm reminding y'all. Any other thoughts or questions from y'all out there? This has been great, you guys, very informative. I really liked both your presentations, very and complementary to one another. Again, think of that maintenance and, you know, how to deter some things from happening. Any other thoughts or questions, you guys? Anybody out there? I think most people are signing up. Oh, is there a link to verify attendance? Yes. They are working on doing attendance for last week that was missed. They are on it. We just switched this particular way to do get the CEUs out just to make it easier on everybody. So yes, you will get a certificate for last week's session. Where we really want to make sure that you're getting what you need out of this. And we understand that that's one of them. So, all right, Luke. All right, Joe. Wow, Joe. This has been great, you guys. I really appreciate you taking time to talk about our natural areas management publication that we have, and I'm looking forward to next week's session on the 24th. And we will see you then, everybody. Thank you and take care for joining, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Luke.
Thank you all. Take care.